Good morning. This is Dr. Basinger, Dr. B, continuing with the video series for Biology 101, assuming that the coronavirus is going to derail our face-to-face meetings for the remainder of the semester. I'm going to voice over, if you will, each of the remaining chapters and provide them for you kind of via YouTube. So, this morning, I want to start out with one of two videos on Chapter 8, talking about photosynthesis as an energy-producing metabolic process. So Chapter 8 is our second topic on metabolism. In Chapter 7, on respiration, we're talking about the release of energy as organic molecules are oxidized. And that release of energy is, some of it is captured as ATP, some of it is lost as thermal energy or heat. In photosynthesis, we're primarily talking about an energy storing reaction where energy is stored in the form of an organic molecule such as a carbohydrate. So, carbon dioxide and water tend to be the most common reactants in photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide tends to be reduced. Hydrogen is added to molecules of carbon dioxide in a cyclical fashion to form carbohydrates. In the first step of photosynthesis, water tends to be oxidized by light energy that strikes chlorophyll molecules, and oxygen tends to be released as hydrogen atoms are removed from the water. During the process of photosynthesis, there tends to be a little bit of regeneration of water, but most of that water that is regenerated tends to be released from the plant by a process that's called transpiration. Carbon dioxide tends to be diffused into a plant from the air around it. Water tends to diffuse into a plant from the soil around the roots of the plant. Again, in this case, we're talking of plants that are living on land, terrestrial, if you will. There tends to be very little glucose in most plants. They tend to quickly convert it into either sucrose, so it can be moved throughout the plant body. And once it gets to its destination, sucrose tends to be formed into starch, which tends to be the primary energy reserve in most plants. Both sucrose and starch are higher level, if you will, or more complex carbohydrates than glucose. Oxygen tends to diffuse out of a plant into the environment, the air around it. Water tends to be released, and plants typically release water from photosynthesis as a vapor or gas, and that's why it's referred to as transpiration. It's the primary cooling mechanism for plants. In the next slide, we will talk about why photosynthesis is an oxidation-reduction reaction. A redox reaction involves reduction, which is the gain of hydrogen and or electrons by a molecule, whereas oxidation is the loss of hydrogen and or electrons from a molecule. In respiration, glucose was oxidized, it lost hydrogen, and the resultant molecule that was formed was carbon dioxide. The hydrogen atoms that were released from glucose in respiration were used to build ATP molecules, and then that hydrogen bonded to oxygen at the end of respiration to form water. So oxygen was reduced in respiration to form water. From what I just said, the exact opposite would be found in photosynthesis. That carbon dioxide is reduced, it gains hydrogen atoms in a cyclical process to form carbohydrates, glucose, most commonly. Water tends to be partially oxidized in the process to form oxygen. So they're globally linked. The reactants of one are the products of another, and vice versa. So photosynthesis and respiration tend to be the two most commonly discussed metabolic processes in biology, in an introductory biology class. The leaf tends to have a structure that is very open in the lower half, fairly closed in the upper half, such that carbohydrates are produced in the upper half, gases can flow through the leaf in the lower half, and then food can be transported in vascular tissue once the carbohydrates are produced in this portion of the leaf. So the leaf tends to be the organ in plants where photosynthesis occurs. The chloroplast, I have a little model of it too. The chloroplast tends to be the organelle where photosynthesis occurs. It has a 5-compartment structure just like a mitochondrion with an outer and inner membrane, thylakoids that are kind of like a stack of pancakes, green of course, that contain pigments such as chlorophylls and carotenoids. We'll talk about those a little bit later. There tends to be a cytoplasm in this organelle called the stroma. It was called the matrix in mitochondrion. Occasionally you find this white structure. You may be able to see it as a starch grain. Sometimes starch grains form in chloroplasts from the polymerization of glucose. The chloroplast is thought to represent a bacterium, a prokaryote that lives inside of eukaryotic cells. Endosymbiosis is the theory for the evolution of chloroplast and also mitochondria. The chloroplast is thought to represent a photosynthetic bacterium that was engulfed by a host cell. It was maintained for its food-producing function and became an organelle inside of a eukaryotic cell. You notice that the plant line of evolution shows 2 endosymbiotic events. The animal and fungus line of evolution just shows 1, the engulfing of an aerobic bacterium, which became the mitochondrion. Both chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA, their own ribosomes. They can produce their own proteins. They divide by fission, and they're pretty much autonomous or independent of the actual nucleus inside of the cell that they're in. So it's thought, in maybe not 100% consensus, but it's pretty well accepted in the scientific community that chloroplasts and mitochondria have a bacterial origin. Let's talk about light and its importance in photosynthesis. Light kind of travels in a wave-like fashion. It's a particle, so that's kind of one of the theories of light in physics, is that light is wave-like and it's also particulate. Light energy can be absorbed, and this absorption of energy is referred to as photons. So light can be absorbed by surfaces. Plants can absorb light energy. Our skin can absorb light energy. And this energy, if you will, that's contained in these waves and particles of light are called photons. The electromagnetic spectrum is shown in the middle of this slide, and that is radiation that emanates from the sun, ranging from gamma radiation all the way to radio waves. Each of these forms of radiation travels, again, in a wave-like manner and consists of particles. And when absorbed, they can transfer energy called photons to the surface or substance that's absorbing this light. Plants typically utilize visible light from the sun for photosynthesis. And visible light tends to have a wavelength within this electromagnetic spectrum of 380 to 750 nanometers. A wave of light, if you measure two consecutive waves, that distance is called a wavelength. The shorter the wavelength, the higher amount of energy, photons, that those waves can transmit when they're absorbed. The further apart the waves are, that means longer wavelength and a lower amount of energy that can be absorbed by some surface or substance that might absorb that light energy. I hope that makes sense. So purple light or violet colored light has a shorter wavelength but a higher amount of photon energy per wave compared to red light that may have a wavelength of 750 nanometers but a lower amount of energy per wave. Photons. Pigments absorb visible light energy from the sun, and they can transmit this energy to produce, say, ATP. They can absorb this energy and split water molecules, as you will see in video 2. Pigments are organic molecules. We have the pigment melanin, a brownish to blackish colored pigment in our skin cells that helps our skin protect it from ultraviolet damage. In plants, you do not find melanin. You find typically chlorophylls and carotenoids in the chloroplast. Chlorophylls reflect green wavelengths of light and absorb blue to violet and orange to red at the opposite ends of the visible light spectrum. Chlorophyll A is considered the pigment of photosynthesis. Carotenoids tend to be observed by us as yellow, orange, or red, and they tend to absorb light that is blue, green, and purple. The third group of pigments that I listed on this slide, anthocyanins, are found in the vacuole. They are water-soluble. Chlorophylls and carotenoids are not water-soluble. They're fat-soluble. They're found in the phospholipid bilayer membrane of the thylakoid. Anthocyanins are water-soluble. They're found in the vacuole. The color that they exhibit to us is dependent on the pH. They can either be reddish, purplish, or even black. Usually they're found in flower petals and in fruits, and they help pollination and dispersal. They're also found in leaves in the fall of the year and provide some of the fall color that we see. But we're mainly going to concentrate on chlorophylls and carotenoids and their role in photosynthesis in explaining the next or last two slides. When you chart or produce a chart that shows what wavelengths of light a pigment absorbs the best, you notice that the chlorophylls tend to absorb light from blue to purple, violet, and then in the orange and red areas. They are the two graphs that are in green. The graph that's in yellow is of the carotenoids, and you notice that they absorb light primarily from green, blue, and purple. So the absorption spectrum shows which wavelengths of light a pigment absorbs the best. This last slide for this video 1 shows the action spectrum, and this primarily indicates to us that chlorophylls are primarily involved and have the highest amounts of photosynthetic output. The action spectrum shows which wavelengths of light are primarily used for photosynthesis. So it's primarily violet, purple, and then orange and red that are your main colors of visible light that are used. So in video 2, we will talk about the process of photosynthesis, what are called the light reactions and the dark reactions, if you will. So I will look forward to beginning that in just a little bit. God bless.